Lord's Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill, I beg to move that this bill be now read a first time.
The question is that this bill be now read a first time. If any of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. My Lords, we come to some instruments previously debated in Grand Committee. East Midlands Combined County Authority Regulations 2024, Baroness Scott of Bybook.
My Lords, I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. Water Industry Act 1991, Amendment Order 2024, and one other motion, Lord Douglas Miller.
My Lords, with the leave of the House, I beg to move the motion standing in my name en bloc.
The question is that the two motions in the name of Lord Douglas Miller be agreed to en bloc. As many of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. Pecuniosis, etc., Workers' Compensation, Payment of Claims, Amendment Regulations 2024, and two other motions, Lord Evans of Rayno on behalf of Viscount Younger of Lecky.
My Lords, with the leave of the House and on behalf of my noble friend Viscount Younger of Lecky, I beg to move the motion standing in his name on the order paper en bloc.
The question is that the three motions in the name of Viscount Younger of Lecky be agreed to en bloc. As many of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. The contents have it. Second reading of the Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Bill, Lord Douglas Miller.
I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. I declare my interests as set out in the Register, and in particular my livestock farming and land management issues. My Lords, we're here to consider the Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Bill, which will fulfil the Government's commitment to end excessively long journeys for slaughter. The bill will ban the export of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs and horses for slaughter and fattening from Great Britain, stopping the unnecessary stress, exhaustion and injury caused by this trade. I think noble Lords will agree, from a welfare perspective, animals should only be transported when necessary. This bill will prevent unnecessarily long export journeys by ensuring that livestock are transported on shorter and less stressful journeys for slaughter domestically. The Government recognises that we are a nation of animal lovers, with some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world. Indeed, we were the first country in the world to pass legislation to protect animals, and we are now building on that tradition by continuing to strengthen our animal welfare standards even further. Looking at farm animal welfare in particular, the Government has launched the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway, providing financial support for farmers to help them improve the health and welfare of their livestock. We have made available £30 million in capital grants to co-fund investment in equipment, technology and infrastructure projects. We have introduced the £4 million Smaller Abattoir Fund, which will improve animal health and welfare and help sustain our network of smaller abattoirs. This support will help to maintain short journey times for livestock to slaughter. This brings us to today's consideration of the Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Bill. My Lords, in the 1990s, a vast number of animals were exported for slaughter each year. This period saw several unsuccessful attempts to ban live animal exports through legal challenges by local and port authorities. At that time, we were bound by EU free trade rules that prevented any such prohibition on live exports. The RSPCA and Compassion for Wild Farming have taken up the cause of live animal exports and have campaigned for a ban on exports for slaughter for over 50 years. Wild Horse Welfare was founded in 1927 with the aim of stopping the export of horses for slaughter, and I'm grateful to these and many other animal welfare organisations for their support of this bill. I also recognise the long-standing interest of many noble Lords in banning live exports. I would particularly like to acknowledge the work of the noble Baroness Fuchs, who I believe It's 21 again today.
Yes, about the fourth time.
And also Baroness Hodgson of Barbinger, Baroness Jones of Moulscombe, and the noble Lord Randall of Uxbridge. I'm grateful for their efforts in championing these causes. We have seen the number of live animal exports decrease significantly over recent decades. Since 2020, there have been no recorded exports for slaughter or fattening from Great Britain to the EU. However, the demand from Europe's slaughterhouses for British livestock, especially sheep, remains. This bill will ensure that this trade cannot resume. There is a clear rationale for this bill. The shortest direct slaughter export journey from Great Britain to continental Europe in 2018 took 18 hours. Most domestic journeys to slaughter in the UK are significantly shorter. Journeys of unweaned calves from Great Britain to fattening in Spain were found to last, on average, 60 hours. The UK government, Scottish and Welsh governments commissioned the Farm Animal Welfare Committee to examine animal welfare during the transport of livestock. Their 2018 report identified several aspects of transport that have a detrimental effect on animal welfare and recommended that animals should only be transported when necessary. Following the committee's report, we undertook a public consultation with the Welsh Government in 2020 on banning live exports. We received over 11,000 responses, and 87% of respondents agreed that livestock and horses should not be exported for slaughter or fattening. The ban on live exports must be GB-wide to be effective, and I am grateful to colleagues in Scotland and Wales for their valuable contributions to this bill. While the bill itself does not extend to Northern Ireland, and I will come on to why shortly, I would also like to thank the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs for their work alongside my officials in the development of our policies. My Lords, I will now turn to the detail of the bill's provision. The core provision prohibits the export of relevant livestock from Great Britain for slaughter and makes it an offence to do so. The bill is focused on banning live exports where major animal welfare concerns have been identified. Accordingly, it legislates to end all exports from and transit journeys through Great Britain of cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, horses for fattening and slaughter. Prior discussions in the other place explored whether the scope of the ban should be extended to cover a wider list of species. When we carried out our consultation in 2020, we were clear about the species we were seeking to apply the ban to. We have received no evidence then, and received none since, that a ban on any other species was necessary. It is also important to be clear about what is not prohibited. The bill still allows for exports of livestock and horses for other purposes, such as breeding, shows, and competitions. Animals exported for breeding were transported in very good conditions so that they can live a full and healthy life once they arrive at their destination. The bill does not apply to journeys within the United Kingdom, the Channel Islands, and the Isle of Man. Let me return to why the bill does not extend to Northern Ireland. To ensure that farmers in Northern Ireland have unfettered access to both the UK and the Republic of Ireland markets, this bill will not apply to Northern Ireland. As part of the new Windsor Framework constitutional arrangements, a minister in charge of a bill must make certain written statements if the bill contains provision that would affect trade between Northern Ireland and other parts of the United Kingdom. Since this bill does not apply to livestock and horse movements within the UK, it is my view that there will be no such impact and that no such statement is therefore required. Recent discussions in the other place highlighted the importance of protecting the access that Northern Irish farmers have to the Republic of Ireland. Farmers in Northern Ireland routinely move animals to the Republic of Ireland for slaughter and fattening. It is critical that we protect the Northern Irish agricultural sector and wider economy, and this is why the bill is drafted as it is in respect of its territorial extent. My Lord, the bill contains a delegated power to provide for regulations about the enforcement of the ban. It empowers the appropriate national authorities to make enforcement regulations and sets out their possible scope. This power will enable the Department to work closely with the Scottish and Welsh governments to provide an effective and proportionate suite of measures to enforce the ban. We intend to bring the ban and its associated enforcement regulations into force as soon as possible. The bill also repeals Section 40 to 49 of the Animal Health Act 1981. These provisions were intended to prevent the export of horses and ponies for slaughter, in particular by setting minimum value standards. Now that we are banning all live exports of horses and ponies for slaughter, these provisions are unnecessary. I know that there is considerable support, both within Parliament and amongst the public, for this ban. I hope that members of your Lordship's House will agree on the importance of working to enhance this country's proud record on animal welfare. This bill marks another significant milestone in our progress towards delivering better animal welfare across the nation. In 2016, the EU referendum brought renewed public interest in finally ending live exports for slaughter. Now that we have this long-awaited opportunity, I hope that your Lordships will support the bill and ensure that our exports take place on the hook rather than on the hoof. I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
My Lords, can I declare my interests, first of all, as Chair of the Royal Veterinary College, and second, as the owner of two opinionated dressage horses who've informed me that no way are they getting on a boat unless it's to travel to the Olympics. I think this may be the noble Lord Douglas Miller's first full bill in this House, so can we welcome him to the joys of second readings. As he said, there is widespread support for this provision, so I hope it will be an easy one to cut his teeth on. Can I thank the Minister and the Government for progressing this bill to prohibit the live export of specified British livestock for slaughter or fattening abroad. Live export sees animals crowded into vehicles, often the first time they're away from their mother, on long, stressful journeys, causing them to suffer from exhaustion and dehydration and even death. These journeys can be very long, as the Minister pointed out, to Spain, which is a 60-hour journey, to Bulgaria, to Hungary, and in some cases from the Republic of Ireland, possibly onwards, though it's difficult to establish, to Middle Eastern destinations, where, of course, very different welfare standards exist. So there really is a strong case for banning this trade. In the most recent year in which live exports occurred, between 25,000 and 50,000 sheep and calves alone were exported from Great Britain annually. This bill stopped this inhumane practice, and though there have been no live animal exports from GB to the European Union since 2020, this isn't due to any lack of wish for the trade to continue, but is mainly due to a lack of suitable post-Brexit border control posts in French and Belgian ports. New border control posts are now being created or existing posts upgraded, and this could open the door to the resumption of the trade were this bill not to be passed. The Secretary of State for DEFRA in another place at second reading confirmed that given the demand from Europe's slaughterhouses for livestock, especially British sheep, as the Minister said, there's no reason to think that this trade would not resume at the first opportunity. So I urge the Minister, and I indeed urge the House, to progress this bill swiftly, to get it through all its stages before the election, whenever that might be. The bill was introduced in the other place in December 2023 and has got to our House within 2 months. Let's keep up the pace that's already been set. This legislation was a 2019 Conservative manifesto commitment a Labour 2019 Animal Welfare Manifesto commitment. It's got support from the Liberal Democrats and from the Greens, and even the Scottish National Party put it into their manifesto in 2021. The public support it overwhelmingly, so let's get it done. Oh dear, I'm beginning to sound like a Conservative. This bill, however, could shine even more, and at the risk of being seen to go against what I've just said about the need for speed, I think that the government ought to be pressed to consider a very small and simple amendment to take secondary legislation powers, enabling powers to allow ministers to add other types of livestock to the list as defined in the bill, should that need arise. It's a pretty rare event for me to be urging ministers to take additional delegated powers, but, you know, things happen. We've got to recognise that the trends in exports have been volatile. In a 10-year period, for example, pig exports went from 30,000 to 600,000. We're seeing an increasing amount of alpacas and deer being farmed. That might well be other species that we need to take swift action on, and it would prevent ministers from having to come forward for primary legislation. So giving ministers the power to add other livestock breeds to the list would future-proof the bill. Secondary legislation is much quicker. Primary legislation would always be behind the curve if numbers of exports were rising. So could I ask the Minister to press on, but with this small and simple amendment? There are, of course, other associated animal welfare issues surrounding animal transport standards, and some of these do need attention, but we must leave these to another bill. Can I thank the British Veterinary Association and the National Farmers Union for briefings on these welfare issues. The European Union is beginning to increase and enhance its standards. Let's not be left behind. We've always had a strong pride, as the Minister said, in our high standards of animal welfare, and we really don't want to fall behind Europe. But that's for another day. There's huge support for this bill, as I said, except from the National Farmers Union, the Farmers Union of Wales and the National Sheep Association. But we should listen and respond to the points being made, particularly by the NFU, that it's vital that the government, when pursuing trade negotiations with countries that export large numbers of animals for fattening and slaughter, ensure that British farmers are not undercut by imports that don't meet the higher standards achieved within the UK. But let's get this done so we can be even more proud of our humane approaches and standards and end live animal exports for fattening and slaughter forever.
Could I draw attention, first of all, to my interest as in the register? And I want to begin by welcoming this bill, which has been a Conservative manifesto commitment since 2017, and which was one component, of course, of the withdrawn Kept Animals Bill, and which bans the export of live animals for fattening and slaughter from GB to anywhere outside the British Islands. And as such, it will prevent the export of living livestock for fattening and slaughter to continental Europe, which historically has already been mentioned, those animals may have subsequently undergone extremely long distance travel with consequent risks to their welfare. It thus fulfills a welfare aspiration of slaughtering livestock as near as possible to their point of rearing, and ensures the exports are on the hook, not on the hoof, as the noble Lord the Minister said. Before I comment on some specifics of the bill, I just want to say that because of the loss of many abattoirs, the distances many animals have to travel for slaughter within the United Kingdom can be substantial now. And I welcome, nonetheless, the recently promised support from His Majesty's Government for small abattoirs. But I want to take this opportunity to emphasise the importance of ensuring the sustainable provision of an adequate network of abattoirs within the UK for all species as an essential animal welfare provision, as well as an important underpinning for the rural economy. Turning now to specifics of the bill, it extends, I note, to England, Wales and Scotland, and I'm delighted to note that the Scottish Government has lodged a legislative consent memorandum in December last year. Horses are included in the bill, and I welcome that, and I note as well that the World Horse Welfare Charity also welcomes that, and it should put an end to the possibility of any long-distance journeys to slaughter for horses, which again, historically, we did see in the past. The bill exempts exports of live animals for breeding and also all exports of poultry, although there are extremely low numbers, if any, of exports of live adult poultry. These exemptions are justified given the importance of the high quality and global significance of UK livestock breeding and genetics, and the relatively low numbers of breeding animals, but their high value, I would submit, ensures the high quality of care afforded to them in transport. My Lords, this is especially so for poultry, where the export of day-old chicks of high-value foundation breeding stock originating in the UK provides the progenitors for a very high proportion of the total global populations of commercial meat and egg-layer poultry. These chicks are air-freighted with great care, since some of them are worth as much as £3,000 each. An important exemption from the bill, though, is that of Northern Ireland, and I recognise the complex political and pragmatic reasons for that, associated with the Windsor Protocol and the land border in the island of Ireland between the UK and the EU. But there are two loopholes associated with this, I suggest. There's a legal loophole whereby animals could be born and reared in Northern Ireland and exported legally to the Irish Republic, after which they could legally be transported anywhere in the EU or beyond, subject to EU rules of movement. Now, whilst legal, this is not, I would suggest, in the spirit of the legislation. It would also be possible for unscrupulous persons to export from GB to Northern Ireland and then arrange further export from Northern Ireland with or without the mandatory 30-day waiting period required. And that, of course, would be illegal, but is a possibility. Given the scale of the movements, the numbers of livestock moved from Northern Ireland into the EU, for example, in 2022, 337,000 sheep were exported from Northern Ireland to the Republic for fattening and slaughter. It would be very difficult to monitor illegal activities. So can I ask the Minister, though, will we be carefully monitoring movements in and out of Northern Ireland, which might indicate if there is any organised systemic attempt to circumvent the good intentions of this bill, which otherwise I warmly welcome.
My Lords, I must first declare an interest as President of a branch of the RSPCA and in the past various other close connections with that organisation. I am most grateful to my noble friend the Minister for his kind birthday congratulations, and I have to say that I could not have a better birthday present than this particular bill. But it's a bit late coming. I was trying to get this done 50-odd years ago as a young, yes, I was young once, MP in the House of Commons. Indeed, my noble friend, Lord Norton of Louth, had done a particular research work on those MPs in the early 70s, Conservative ones, who had voted against the government. And he dug up for me a particular occasion where I wanted to see the withdrawal of licences so that the animals could not be exported. The government of the day put in a wrecking amendment, so I voted against it, and on that occasion we won. Animal exports stopped, but of course, as we all know, there has been a history since, and I have been spectacularly unsuccessful in getting the ban, I and those others who shared that view. Indeed, in '74, that is 50 years ago almost to the day, I asked the Minister if he would have a permanent ban on the export of live animals. And he did a bit of waffling about the need to consult, which is the usual thing when they don't want to take action. And I quote, I said, I recognise the Minister's need to consult, but would he bear in mind that any attempt to resume these exports will be met with my implacable hostility. I have maintained implacable hostility for the 50 years since. But why was I so opposed? Because at that time I heard first-hand accounts from RSPCA inspectors who had gone undercover. The proper government inspectorate didn't seem to be working, so they did it themselves, and they followed particular consignments right the way through, from where they started to where they ended at abattoirs. And it was heartbreaking. I mean, over the years, millions of animals have been suffering in this way. Very often, the vehicles they were transported in were quite unsuitable. Sound animals and injured animals were allowed to go together, and some sound animals became injured anyway through the conditions under which they were working. Sometimes food and water was missing. The hours, as the noble Lady Young has pointed out, were extremely long, and sometimes, of course, or indeed more often than not, the conditions in which they were slaughtered eventually were horrifying in themselves. So this is why I felt so deeply and strongly, and although maybe conditions have improved slightly, not enough for my concerns. And I share very much the mantra of the British Veterinary Association from years ago, that slaughter should take place as near the point of production as possible. But let me turn now to the bill itself, which, as I say, I warmly welcome. I do see one small weakness. I know my noble friend has indicated that we're covering all the main animals, and I accept that entirely. But there could come a time when other animals which are not now exported could be, and they would not be covered. And I share the wish to have an amendment put in so that we could have a regulation which would permit this to happen. I've looked carefully at all the regulations that we've got already, and it doesn't seem to me that any of those would cover it. It is actually unusual for me to want regulations. When I was chairman of the committee which looked at these things, I was forever railing and rating against the unsuitable, extensive use of regulations. But here I make an exception, and I would hope that my noble friend might consider this without, of course, allowing the bill to fall by the wayside, which is always at this time a concern and a worry. Others have also mentioned, and I will do so briefly, my concern that animals within the country have better regulations, and I would like to have an assurance from my noble friend that the regulations that are in place are being enforced. Because it doesn't matter how good they are, if they're not enforced, it's as though they're not there at all. And also, I would like to see those regulations improved. Unless I'm much mistaken, we're still operating on the 2005 regulations from the European Union, which have been transferred into British law and now have some other fancy title, which I forget. But anyway, I would like to see those improved, because the hours allowed for those are quite a lot. I think it's 19 hours for calves and more for others. That, I think, is far too long. And I do support the arrangement for small abattoirs to be encouraged so that we can get animals off transport at great length and into abattoirs where we can ourselves ensure that the conditions are humane. So I would hope that my noble friend can give some reassurances on these matters. But that said, my lords, I have waited a long time for this, and it couldn't have come on a better time than my birthday.
My lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the noble Baroness Lady Fuchs, and I pay tribute to her and other noble members of this House who have done so much to bring us to the point that we are today. And the reputation of this country as a country of animal lovers is well earned and well deserved. It's to the enormous credit of the United Kingdom that we have some of the toughest animal welfare legislation on the statute book anywhere. And I do congratulate the government on the work that it's done to introduce legislation in recent years to strengthen even further the protection for animals in the United Kingdom. And I reference in particular the Animal Welfare Sentencing Act in 2021. The legislation today before us has been heralded by the government as bringing an end to unnecessary journeys abroad for slaughter of live animals. And in the other place, the Secretary of State, in introducing the bill at second reading, said, and I quote, "Taking advantage of Brexit freedoms, we can now legislate to end this trade which we were unable to do so for many years due to European Union trade rules." End quotes. I have to say in passing that it has taken the government a long time to bring this legislation to this point, given that it was a pledge that was made during the Brexit campaign itself and has been referenced in various manifesto commitments of all the parties. However, the more fundamental criticism I have of this bill is something that has already been referenced both by the noble Lord the Minister and other speakers in this debate, and that is that it only applies to Great Britain and not the entirety of the United Kingdom. And why is this? Now, the government has said in the other place and today at the dispatch box, and I don't in any way criticise the noble Lord the Minister who is here today presenting this bill. These issues are way beyond the remit of the particular department in which he serves, and as I say, I congratulate him on bringing this bill to the House today. However, the government's position is that it's because it wants to ensure that Northern Ireland has unfettered access to the United Kingdom and the Irish Republic. That makes it sound as if this is a wonderful proactive measure, that the government has thought about the situation, has developed its policy, and has proactively decided to omit Northern Ireland for the best of reasons, that it has had a choice as to what it should do. But, my lords, the reality is very different, and it is important on all these issues that we have proper transparency and openness in all of these matters. And we have had this in relation to trade bills and others where the arguments put forward from the dispatch box do not always tell the full story of why things are being done because of the Windsor Framework. The fact is that the reason that this bill does not apply to Northern Ireland is because it cannot. It isn't because it's a policy decision or a desire of the government. It cannot apply because the Windsor Framework or the Northern Ireland Protocol prevents it from being applied to Northern Ireland, and it is European law which takes precedence and has supremacy over Northern Ireland in this whole area. And as I say, the pattern of seeking to spin and hide the reality of the extent to which Northern Ireland is forced, not out of choice, but is forced to adopt different laws and rules across hundreds of areas of law applicable to large parts of our economy. This is something that needs to be continually exposed. We're seeing it in the area of parliamentary questions, and I raise this matter because on a recent question on veterinary medicines and their supply to Northern Ireland, a very important matter as far as the welfare of animals is concerned, and indeed for wider human health implications as well. I have tabled a question, and the noble Lord the Minister in reply to a question as to whether or not there were current negotiations with the European Union on the supply of veterinary medicines to Northern Ireland, which everybody accepts needs to continue. The reply consisted of 3 sentences, not one of which even referenced an answer to the question. And, my Lords, I would be grateful if the Minister could take away that matter and tell and write to me or explain, even in his answer when he comes to speak, are there current negotiations with the European Union about getting veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland? That would be just useful to know. Are there any current negotiations going on with the European Union in this area? But, my Lords, to return to this bill, the reason Northern Ireland is excluded from these provisions is because the government has had to exclude Northern Ireland at the behest of the EU, which has sovereignty over Northern Ireland in this area. It is simply no choice in the matter. Now, many people will have different views on the merits of the substance of the bill and what it does, but whatever your view, whether you're for the ban on live exports or against, it should be a decision for lawmakers in the United Kingdom or for representatives of the people of Northern Ireland. That's the point of principle in this. In this case, the law is already decided by a foreign political entity in which they have no say and in which they are not represented and whose decision is final. And this, my Lords, is another example of the Irish Sea border in action. And there is nothing in the new government command paper 1021 and the deal that was recently done that removes this. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this legislation before us today, or we would have legislation which did encompass the whole of the United Kingdom, which created an exception for the Irish Republic, would have put an end to journeys going further into the European Union, to Spain and elsewhere, which the Minister, the Noble Lord the Minister, has rightly painted as being unacceptable in this day and age. My Lord, you don't have to take my word for this. The government's own impact assessment on live animal exports at paragraph 13 states that the option of banning live exports of animals for slaughter, and I quote here, cannot be implemented in Northern Ireland. End quotes. Cannot. It says, in quotes, Northern Ireland will continue to follow EU legislation on animal welfare in transport for as long as the Northern Ireland Protocol, or Windsor Framework, is in place. That's under Article 5 of the Protocol, in conjunction with Annex 2, subsection 40. So the question of principle here is that this bill does not and cannot extend to Northern Ireland, not because of any policy decision made by legislators or by government, but because European law demands that it cannot apply. And that, frankly, is not an acceptable position in the United Kingdom in 2024. And as I say, there are strong arguments in favour of the bill, and these have been well described. The conditions under which some animals have had to travel for slaughter over long, long distances have been clearly highlighted. When I was the member in the other place for North Belfast, I received countless representations on this issue. On the other hand, there are people in Northern Ireland and in the farming community who point to the fact that large numbers of sheep are exported to the Irish Republic, and the Noble Lord Trees made reference to the very large numbers that are sent from Northern Ireland to the Irish Republic for slaughter. And the significant number of dairy-bred calves that are exported to Spain. They point to the advantages of competition in the market for livestock and to the fact that there have been major improvements in relation to standards. These arguments are well rehearsed in Northern Ireland. But whichever side of the argument you are on, one thing should be clear, one thing should be accepted, and that it should be for ourselves as legislators, either in Northern Ireland or in this place, to make that decision, not to have it imposed upon us, not to have UK ministers going around trying to gild the lily or portray it as a choice. It isn't a choice. Their own documents admit that they cannot apply it to Northern Ireland. So why not be honest, open and transparent about it? That we are not sovereign. We cannot make our own animal welfare decisions for the whole of the country. And once again, the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom has been set to one side. The right to make democratic decisions by UK lawmakers has been set to one side, and the sovereignty of our country in this area has been set to one side, and that is unacceptable. And the fight will go on to highlight the denial of that equal citizenship to the people of Northern Ireland as a result of these inequitable arrangements.
Hear, 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 hear.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend the Minister for his excellent introduction to this much-awaited bill, and I warmly welcome him to his new ministerial role. I'm hoping that this bill will have quick progress through this House based on the cross-party support it received in the other place, and indeed the broad number of animal welfare organisations that have welcomed it. I recognise that there are many noble lords in this chamber with a deep knowledge of agriculture and animal welfare, but I would like to declare my interests. As a director of a company that owns a little farming land, that I served on the Rural Economy Select Committee in 2019 and the Farm Animal Welfare Council some time ago. It will come as no surprise to the Minister that I support this bill following the amendments I tabled on this exact topic in the Agriculture Bill back in 2019. I argued then that we have a moral responsibility, be it as farmers or end-user consumers, to recognise that animals are sentient beings, and we should seek to encourage and support the industry in raising them and slaughtering them in the most kindly and humane way possible. I do not propose to run through all the reasons why this bill is much needed. Others have done that. But we should remember that not all countries in Europe have the same attention to detail for welfare provisions as we do in the UK. And there were even some animals that I understand were being re-exported on to the Middle East. The long journeys caused intolerable stress, injury and exhaustion, and the case studies we have heard were harrowing. So once animals leave our shores, there is no control over how they are kept or slaughtered, and thus it is important that we stop this practice for once and for all. Although I understand that at the present time there are almost no animals going abroad for slaughter, we should not forget that in 2019 the figures were around 35,000 sheep and calves being exported to the EU from the UK. And whilst at this present time this trade has stopped, there is no guarantee that there will not be a future demand, and therefore it is important to get this bill onto the statute books. This bill is another step alongside a raft of other measures which are part of the reason that under a Conservative government the UK is joint top of the World Animal Protection Index. So whilst we're considering journey times, I hope that your lordships will forgive me if I also raise the issue of slaughterhouses in this context, as the noble Lord Trees has already done. In welfare terms, I hope we're all agreed that animals need to be slaughtered at the nearest point to production, as my noble friend Baroness Fuchs has already stated. And I'm pleased that this bill will help to ensure that our animals are slaughtered domestically to our higher welfare standards. However, the EU regulations caused many small slaughterhouses to close, from around 1,000 in 1985 to 285 by 2006, with around 10 large companies slaughtering the majority of animals. This has caused longer travel times for the animals regionally, and I would like to ask my noble friend the Minister to take this opportunity to update us on the work of the Small Abattoirs Working Group and the trials of the Mobile Abattoir Project testing the use of a compact system for on-farm slaughter of livestock, which started in 2021, as referenced in the government response to the EFRA Select Committee report, Moving Animals Across Borders. Of course, small abattoirs must be commercially viable businesses, as well as custodians of the highest welfare standards, and I await the Minister's comments with interest. As a party, we have previously made manifesto commitments not to compromise our food, environmental and animal welfare standards as part of any future trade deals. Allowing food in not raise the standards we demand in the UK not only undercuts our farmers, it encourages poor animal welfare standards in other countries. Last year, my noble friend Lord Benyon stated that imports to the UK for slaughter and fattening were low. Will the Minister undertake to keep this number under review in case we need to seek to address this in the future? I do not propose that we hold up this bill by seeking to add in this issue, but insist that it is part of the continued wider conversation and aspiration to address. In short, I welcome and support this bill and remind their lordships of the line that agriculture is a fundamental source of national prosperity, and that it is not even mentioning food security in a time when the world seems so increasingly volatile.
My Lords, I too welcome the Noble Lord the Minister to his first bill. I can assure him this is the easiest bill he will ever touch, and therefore I think getting it through quite fast would be a good idea. I'd also like to thank him for the briefing that he gave. I did slightly resent his team not answering my question about where the flaws were. They suggested that was my job and I had to look for myself. I'm not sure there's ever been a bill since I arrived here in your Lordship's house, that's 10 years, that hasn't had at least one flaw, if not thousands. Because this government is so good at bad legislation, we see some really awful things here. But I did think I might deserve a finder's fee for spotting a Brexit benefit, but others had already made that joke, including the Noble Lord the Minister himself, I think. So the figures I've seen on live exports are absolutely horrendous, and I can't believe that people actually thought it was okay to treat animals like this, subjected to journeys of over 2,000 miles lasting 70 hours. If we don't get this bill enacted, as other noble lords have said, it could start again. And I do want to support Lady Young and Lady Fuchs on the issue of other species being allowed to be brought in by a Secretary of State. I too have fought against such measures, but here I think it is appropriate. And of course the tough regulation, that's incredibly important, that the regulation is not only tough, but it is actually overseen properly. And obviously he's going to have implacable hostility from several noble ladies if that doesn't happen. So I do support this bill, and I think the harshest thing I can say about it is about time.
My Lords, I also very much welcome this bill and the second reading of it. It has many, many admirable aims, which I fully support. I declare my own interests as a farmer, including sheep farming, as set out in the register. I'm also a member of the NFU, which has circulated a focused briefing on the issues, with which I largely concur. Like others, I'm also delighted that this is the first bill that has been led by the Noble Lord the Minister. I fully support the overall objective of this bill and other welfare legislation which has been granted royal assent over recent years. This makes our country a world leader in treatment of animals and is something to be rightly proud of. Whilst the overall purpose of the bill is very good, I have concerns over the unintended side effects of the legislation, which will of course directly hit farmers who are already facing a perfect storm with the reduction of farm payments, inflation affecting inputs, and adapting to the most monumental changes brought about by farming policy since the Agriculture Act of 1947. It will also adversely affect their export markets and the flexibility of their businesses going forward. That just needs to be noted. The trade of store sheep to the continent for fattening and slaughter, whilst never making up the majority of UK exports of sheep, was still a valuable avenue for a number of farmers, particularly in the southeast of the country, with it accounting for, at its peak, for around 10% of sheep exports. One of the main points given in support of this bill is that since December 2020, there have been no live exports from the UK. This, however, is not because farmers have simply stopped doing it, but because of a lack of proper border controls, as mentioned by Baroness Young. And that has been because of the lack of border control posts being in place to administer all the post-Brexit checks. Reopening the store market for live exports is not welcomed by the government nor me, but exports for breeding is encouraged. Therefore, I ask the Noble Lord the Minister, what additional investment are the government putting in to make certain that this shortage of border control posts with live animal facilities at the border is addressed? My Lord, surely by having sufficient border control points in place and encouraging the export of animals bred and transported to a high welfare level will address the likely pernicious side effect of this legislation if the border control posts are not in place. If they're not in place, there will be an increase of animals being exported to our erstwhile markets of France, Belgium and the Netherlands from East European and Australasian countries, which have a much weaker animal welfare protection system in place. Our priority should be overall animal welfare, which can be achieved by better investment in border control facilities, transport infrastructure, and the exploration of welfare assurance schemes as recommended by the NFU. The final point I would like to make is that a key reason why some farmers have in the past sent non-breeding exports across the Channel is that the 31 miles across the Channel is closer than the nearest abattoir in the UK to the number of in the UK due to the number of abattoir closures, which has already been highlighted by Baroness Fuchs, by Lord Trees and Baroness Hodgson. The estimate being that numbers have reduced by a third since 2014, including McIntyre Meats last week in the Prime Minister's constituency. The unfortunate consequence is that some farmers undertake 200-mile journeys to abattoirs in the UK, while the government's smaller abattoir fund and its £4 million of available funding is a step in the right direction. It is unfortunately not enough, as is eloquently put by the for Westmoreland and Lonsdale in the other place, when he said it wouldn't even touch the sides of his constituency, let alone the country as a whole. With each closure of an abattoir, farmers must travel further afield, adding to journey time, stress and cost of production, which is making some livestock businesses unviable. Also, most importantly, it has a negative impact on animal welfare, as the affected animals have to undergo these long journeys, which completely negates what the government is trying to achieve, particularly as mentioned in the government's manifesto commitment to end excessively long journeys for slaughter, for fattening, by enabling shorter and less stressful journeys. I'd be interested to hear from the Noble Lord the Minister what additional support the government is proposing to prevent the closure of abattoirs to keep this sector viable. In particular, is the government considering creating a working group to look at the 5% rule, which governs the number of animals slaughtered without a vet being present, as recommended by the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee in 2021, and also the government's continuing support for the mobile abattoir pilot? Thank you.
My Lords, I have one very vivid memory of speaking at a meeting during the referendum campaign back in 2016, where all sorts of speeches were made and very grand ideas put forward. And then right at the end of the meeting, one lady got up and said, "I don't care about any of this," she said. "The only reason I'm voting to leave the EU is so that we can get rid of getting live animal exports for slaughter." I don't think she actually used the word slaughter, but it was a very vivid example of how many people saw specific things in the referendum campaign that they knew that the EU were doing that they wanted to change, and that was one of them. And I'm just disappointed in a way that the government has taken so long to get this what really is a relatively simple bill to come back, and it's a bit like a number of other issues where, you know, the sort of idea of taking back control seems to have frightened civil servants and frightened ministers, so that it's taken a lot longer to get these things done. But I want to also pay tribute to Baroness Fuchs and to the many peers and members in the other place who have campaigned on this for a very, very long time and have kept it in the public domain. I remember very clearly 2012-13 when we had lots of demonstrations down at Ramsgate and Dover, and I think for a lot of the public, they saw for the first time the horror of what was going on in some of those lorries with sheep packed and the long journeys ahead. And it's that kind of campaigning that has got to this stage, and that's where Noble Lady Baroness Fuchs has played such a huge role. Now, of course, I will support this bill, but like some others who've mentioned, there are some changes, and I certainly would like it to go a lot further. It really isn't acceptable here in the United Kingdom Parliament, House of Lords, that this bill is not going to apply to Northern Ireland. I want to thank the Minister for, after I'd asked a question on this, for reaching out and having a very interesting and useful meeting. Not sure that it was particularly useful in terms of changing things, but I do accept that the Minister has done his best in his role to listen to what those of us who feel very strongly about this and who feel that animal welfare should be a United Kingdom-wide matter, and that ways could be found, even at this late stage, in committee stage, to ensure that it does apply to the United Kingdom as a whole, because there's no good reason why this bill could not have applied to Northern Ireland, with an amendment clause making it clear that when animals are being exported to the Republic, a final destination must be stated when it crosses over the border from Northern Ireland. Of course, the aim is to stop animals being taken for long journeys in terrible suffering. But this will not have been achieved for the thousands of animals who will in future still be able to be transported from Northern Ireland through the Republic onwards into the continent of Europe and on perhaps even to North Africa, much longer journeys than are happening at the moment. As the member for East Antrim, I hope I've got it right, said in the other place, Sammy Wilson, he said, it's a bit like a Pontius Pilate. As long as the animals don't go through Great Britain, morally we can all sit back here and say, oh, it's great, we've done it. But actually, what we haven't done is really change the situation, because at the moment, as we all know and has been said, there's hardly anything being exported, and there hasn't been for the last couple of years, from Great Britain. But actually, all that time, there's been animals being exported from Northern Ireland through the Republic of Ireland. And it really is, I think, a little bit, not from the Noble Lord the Minister, but overall from the government, a little bit hypocritical, the way that they have tried to emphasise that this is all Northern Ireland's being left out because of the deep concern that the government has for the farmers not being able to take their cattle over the border to be fattened or to abattoirs. And if I could just say on abattoirs, absolutely agree that the ruination of those small abattoirs by EU rules was something that, again, we should be able to do something more about. And the £4 million is really very, very little, and that needs to be looked at. The truth is, of course, and it's not to do with protecting Northern Ireland agricultural farmers, the truth is, as the Noble Lord Dodds has said, is that as in so many other areas of legislation now, and we're going to keep hearing this, is that European Union law overrules UK law in Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework Protocol is being treated, making sure that Northern Ireland is being treated once again differently from the rest of the UK. It was a manifesto commitment from the government, and yet again we've seen the government has to kowtow to European Union rules. And another area which we have just confirmed really that again on an animal welfare issue we're going to have differences is that the Secretary of State assurances that pets travelling from England or Scotland or Wales to Northern Ireland would no longer have any administrative, any bureaucracy. We are now, of course, discovering specifically that they are going to have to be treated differently. They are going to have to apply for pet documents. So the government really needs to accept that if they wanted to, if they really wanted to, they could change this to make this bill apply to the whole of Northern Ireland. They'll come back, and the Minister didn't mention it, but I'm sure he will in his wind-up, about the WTO, that we couldn't do this because we couldn't make these special exceptions for the Republic of Ireland and the cross-border trade that is important and needs to continue, because the WTO on the Favoured Nations Treaty would rule that that was not possible. But there is an exemption in the General Agreement on Tariffs Trade 1994, which actually clearly says one of the exceptions enables states to take necessary measures to protect human, animal or plant life or health. And there has been some legal opinion published that holds that one of those articles, XX, which enables states to act to protect public morals, is an even stronger basis for justifying trade restrictions based on animal welfare concerns. And this has been used before with challenges both in Canada, and it's quite set out very clearly in the explanatory method. So there is a way of doing this. And it's not even as if we have to ask permission to do it. We can do it. And then if somebody wants to complain, then we can take that up with the WTO if the WTO try to stop it. So I'm not wanting to in any way hold this bill up. I know that I wouldn't be able to ever have a cup of coffee even with Baroness Fuchs again if that happened. But I do think that there are one or two minor amendments, I think very important amendments, but minor amendments that we could hear at committee stage and that the government could accept if they had the will. And I would just say to all those, if this doesn't get changed and Northern Ireland can't be brought into it, then I hope that all those noble lords who are so supportive and think the European Union is wonderful and also are desperately keen on animal welfare, perhaps they might just decide that it would be a good idea to lobby the European Union to actually get rid of their rules which allow this terrible, horrible trade to continue right across Europe.
My Lords, obviously, I welcome the noble Lord the Minister onto the front bench and to his second reading of his first bill in your Lordship's House. Obviously, on some of the issues, I take a different view to the noble Lady Hoey in relation to this particular bill. I want to talk from a Northern Ireland perspective, which may seem rather odd since Northern Ireland is not covered by this legislation, but there are obviously very good reasons for that, because the provisions in the bill, as the noble Lord the Minister has said, seek to prohibit the export of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs and equines for slaughter, including fattening for subsequent slaughter, beginning in or transiting through GB to the EU, Member States and other third countries, and this in itself does not apply to Northern Ireland. That, for practical, agricultural, trading, political and animal health reasons, is the right decision. And that fact was recognised by the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the other place on the 15th of January in response to the debate, when he stated that this bill must not jeopardise the access that Northern Ireland farmers have to the Republic of Ireland. And I hope that all of us, noble lords, today recognise the economic and trading importance of agriculture to both parts of Ireland, and the fact that farmers and also those involved in trading do try to adhere to animal health standards. And there is another feature. The island of Ireland, both north and south, for animal health purposes, is treated as a single animal health epidemiological unit, and that has been persisting for many years, because of the nature of the trade on an ongoing daily basis, to and fro. And that is essential for the agri-food industry and for its success. Agri-food on the island of Ireland is interlinked. Northern Ireland farmers have invested, I would have to say, much time and energy in maintaining very good, world-leading animal welfare practices, including how animals are transported. And, in fact, the farming unions in Northern Ireland would refute any claim or any suggestion that anti-animal welfare conditions exist. But I'm also mindful of what the noble Lord Trees has said, and that is absolutely correct, that in all these movements there have to be proper monitoring procedures in place. But I do think that much of that is covered by the fact that it is a single animal health epidemiological unit. The bottom line, my lords, is that Northern Ireland farmers need access to markets and need access to the Republic of Ireland and maintained mainland EU for live animals, and particularly for the sheep sector. And reference has already been made to it, that in fact for the last year for which statistics are available, in 2022, 337,000 sheep moved from Northern Ireland to the Republic for slaughter and fattening, and there were about 3,500 cattle and 17,000 pigs as well for slaughter. The dairy sector also needs this avenue maintained for dairy-bred bull calves, as a limited market exists in Northern Ireland. And if we go back in evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee inquiry in the other place, which took place in 2018 into live animals, the Farmers' Union in Northern Ireland stated that two agri-food industries on the island of Ireland are highly integrated and they move both ways, and that two-way movement is historic and essential. The Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board also highlighted to that committee inquiry the importance of the processing capacity in the Republic to red meat sectors. For example, with the pig industry, sows go across the border for slaughter and then back again. Cross-border movement was not only important for Northern Ireland's trade with the Republic, but also with other countries as well. Calves from Northern Ireland destined for France are regularly transported through ports in the Republic of Ireland. So therefore, my lords, and I know that the noble Lady Hoey and the noble Lord Dodds have referred to the influence of the Windsor Framework, I am glad that the Windsor Framework is in place, because it will ensure that the agri-food industry in Northern Ireland is protected, because there will be that free movement of livestock for export purposes and also for slaughter and fattening on the island of Ireland. It recognises that trade in live animals from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland should be allowed to continue, and I hope it will be. The UFU, the Ulster Farmers Union, and farming organisations asked for this to happen in 2018, and thankfully this legislation today recognises the need to leave Northern Ireland out from its provisions. But, my noble lords, I have a question for the Minister about a more pertinent issue, because I think we need to turn our attention to the EU proposals on animal transport that will apply in Northern Ireland, and it is important that the UK Government, in negotiations with the EU on behalf of Northern Ireland farmers, ensure that the transport of live animals with all the proper animal welfare conditions in place is maintained. That is, to the EU is maintained. This is vital for the safeguarding and protection of our agri-food industry on the island, which is highly integrated. So in that regard, I would like to ask the noble Lord the Minister if he could indicate or if he's not able to provide that information in his wind-up today, if he could write to me and also place a copy in the library of your Lordship's house, what discussions have been held with the EU regarding the need to ensure that the transport of live animals to mainland EU is retained, as this is vital for our agri-food industry, which is highly integrated on the island of Ireland. And, my Lords, I support this legislation. Animal welfare regulations and animal welfare standards are vital to the agri-food industry. But equally important is the need to ensure that we have that free movement of animals for slaughter and for fattening purposes on the island of Ireland. Hence, whilst welcoming the legislation, I'm glad it does not include Northern Ireland.
My Lords, I draw attention to my entry in the Register of Interests. It's a pleasure to be able to speak in this debate, and I welcome the Government's commitment to improving the standards of animal welfare in the UK. And I'd like to add my thanks, first of all, to the Noble Lord the Minister, as he begins in this new role, and also to those who have campaigned for so long, particularly for Baroness Folks on her birthday. Speaking to farmers and farm vets in Suffolk, they are clear that the exporting of animals for slaughter is not an acceptable practice, and I fully support this bill. They've raised with me a couple of related points, both of which have been made already, but which I will briefly refer to. First, we must ensure that holding British farmers to high welfare standards does not result in the undercutting of our farmers by cheaply produced imported meat that does not meet the same standards required of UK farmers. I hope the Government is able to provide farmers with the assurances they need on this matter. Equally, it's important that the consumers in Britain can feel confident that the produce that they are buying meets the appropriately high standards of animal welfare that we expect of British farmers, regardless of where the meat originated. Producing food in the UK remains a vital role in protecting the food security of the country, which of course is another whole issue. I support calls for the NFU and others to establish core production standards that apply to agri-food imports and to establish best practice protocols for transporting animals. Secondly, one of the key drivers of the desire to export live animals, a desire which could easily be reignited to export live animals for slaughter, has been the reduction in the number of UK slaughterhouses. As we have already heard, this results in longer journeys to slaughterhouses within the UK, not only an animal welfare concern, but also drives up emissions associated with the transport of livestock. Transport of animals to small and medium-sized abattoirs often have the shortest overall journey lengths, and it's important that we have sufficient network of abattoirs, and in particular small and medium-sized ones, so that our food supply chain can be as humane as possible. I'd also like to add my support for the possibility of an amendment to achieve a simple device for adding new animals or animals newly added to the list. My Lords, as a country, we strive to be a world leader in animal welfare standards, and I fully support this legislation and its speedy progress.
My Lords, I'm delighted to follow the Right Reverend Prelate and to participate in the second reading of this bill. My interests are that I chaired the Environment, Rural Affairs and Environment Committee in the other place, and I also served as an MEP for 5 years, for 10 years even, 10 years. I'm extremely proud of the high animal welfare conditions met by our livestock producers in this country. Yet, as we've heard, there are no EU border posts currently in place, so it's impossible for our livestock producers to export, not even for legitimate breeding purposes. So while we're admitting breeding stock from the EU, with health checks conducted at the farm of destination, there are no reciprocal arrangements in place for British breeding stock to the EU, other than through Ireland, as we've heard. The bill therefore seems to address a problem which does not exist, the live export of animals for fattening and slaughter, but fails to solve a real problem which does exist, that of failure to export breeding stock. I'd like to ask my noble friend the Minister when the government will address this. In the view of the National Sheep Association, this is a matter of utmost urgency. I'm grateful to my noble friend the Minister for taking on this bill as his first bill, and also for his briefing with us on the 30th of January and his subsequent letter which I received today. My Lords, I have some personal history with this issue. As the Member of the European Parliament for Brightlingsea, exports came through that port when the port of Dover stopped the movement of live animals in 1992. A vigorous campaign was mounted by a rather unknown organisation at that time, run by a mother and daughter, the embryo of Compassion in World Farming. The manager of the port of Brightlingsea suffered attacks to his home, and the town was overrun by visiting protesters at the transport of live animal, protesting about the live transport of animals through the ferries. I made a point of going to visit and board the ferry for myself and to see firsthand the comfortable conditions in which these sheep were transported, frankly superior to those enjoyed by foot passengers on many cross-channel ferries at that time. However, it's important to note that the live export of animals has always been a very limited trade, a heavily regulated trade, as the maximum hours and resting periods that animals could travel with regular feeding and water intervals heavily regulated throughout the EU. Given its significance at the time to livestock producers in the north of England and Scotland, it was economically important for sheep and cattle, particularly sheep, for the same reasons as my noble friend himself said and others on poultry exports, which will continue. They are of high value and they meet the highest animal welfare standards, which is why our sheep live exports was so welcome, particularly in France. The impact assessment gives the figures for 2020, exports of all livestock, as sheep for slaughter 6,272 and for fattening 38,111, with 4 goats for fattening. They must have been very important, those 4 goats. The bill, as currently drafted, raises a number of questions. Why is the ban not on a reciprocal basis? Why is it only impacting producers in Great Britain? And why is it discriminating against our own producers in favour of EU exporters, in particular breeding stock? Presumably, I'd like to ask my noble friend, there may be some livestock coming from the EU to this country for fattening and slaughter purposes, no matter how small a trade. So I would like to see an amendment from the government to make this bill work on the basis of reciprocity. And why is poultry excluded? The same welfare conditions should surely apply to them as for other livestock, such as sheep and cattle, in particular in view of the fact that they do not travel as well as other livestock, such as sheep. As we've heard from a number of speakers this afternoon, the bill as drafted contains a glaring loophole, in particular referred to by the noble Lords Trees and Lord Dobbs. Livestock movement between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be permitted. That means that any animal under the provisions of the ban in the bill could potentially be exported from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and through the Republic of Ireland for onward export to other parts of the EU, entailing a much longer journey, undermining what are the key animal welfare provisions of this bill. I understand that that route is currently the only route available for breeding stock. The noble lady, Baroness Ritchie of Downpatrick, very eloquently described the importance of the agri-food industry to Northern Ireland. I would echo that. It is an extremely important industry to the whole of the United Kingdom. And I would like to ask my noble friend, given the fact that basic payments are reducing that the ELMS criteria are still extremely fuzzy, and yet we face a rising need for food security. What does the government action plan for beleaguered livestock farmers, particularly in the upland areas of England, which were the source of much of this live trade in the past? Again, I think I understand the figures were always quoted as for every live animal that was exported, 7 were in carcass form. So the vast majority of this trade will continue, but in carcass form. A further problem I would ask the government to address is the lack of a phytosanitary agreement with the European Union. There is indeed a chapter in the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which has never come into effect. Does my noble friend not agree that it's extremely important, as others have stated this afternoon, that any import, whether from the EU or a third country coming via the EU, must match the same high standards as applied in this country? This gap in regulatory agreement, together with the new controls at UK border posts, is causing grave concerns to farmers and consumer groups alike. I understand that the new BOTOM regulations that are coming into effect is moving the checkpoint some 20 miles from those envisaged in the port of Dover to Severington, as I say, 20 miles away. I would argue that this is a hostage to fortune and not conducive to effective checks on entry to this country on plant and animal health. May we pause and remember the recent cases of ash tree dieback and the horse meat fraud, which should serve as a wake-up call for greater vigilance on imported foods, whether live animals for breeding purposes or plants and food products coming in through this checkpoint at Severington. There is also concern about the reliance at sale and production points on environmental health and trading standards officers at a time when local authority budgets are under severe constraint. I would conclude by saying that no farmer has willingly exported a live animal for export, for slaughter and fattening. No farmer has willingly exported a live animal for export or slaughter in recent times. I would like to pay tribute, and I hope my noble friend and the House will join me, to the very high standards that our farmers meet as expected by the UK consumers, but that I hope that the beleaguered livestock industry in this country will soon have some good news from the government and certainty as to what their future will be.
I also welcome this bill and am in awe of the passion shown by many members of this noble House to getting this bill to this stage. I wish to note my interests in the register. The simplicity of the bill is a strength and hopefully will add to a quick passage through the House. But by keeping it simple, it has the potential to miss certain areas of animal welfare. The range of farm animals that are included are the principal main production animals. But it does leave the minority of animals out. Those not mentioned as like birds. I took on board and thanked the noble Minister for his time during the briefing regarding the exporting of young poultries, also mentioned in detail by my noble friend Lord Trees. I would also welcome and back Lady Young and Lady Folkes on their amendments for these species to be included if required in the future by the Secretary of State. As humans have generally shown over the years, where there is an opportunity or a loophole, people will seek to use it in some ways, and this will only be to the detriment of a small number of animals and birds in the future. Due to the focused nature of the bill, there is a missed opportunity to improve the general legislation with regards to the transport of animals throughout the UK and for the export for breeding and competition purposes. Some of these journeys can be significant in length and time, and we need to protect animals during this transportation. I ask the Government to look again at this legislation to ensure that we can continue to improve animal welfare standards during transportation, to include time and distance travelled, to monitor the health and welfare of these animals, and also include driver skills levels and the design of transport vehicles and the stocking density. As mentioned by Baroness Hodgson, the support of local abattoirs is essential to keep the transportation distance down to a minimum for animals due to slaughter. This proposed legislation can only happen due to the UK leaving the EU. Animals are benefiting from this legislation, but we need to also ensure the farming industry benefits as a whole too. The export of farm animals was a minor but significant part of the fresh and frozen meat sector, and the only reason it has reduced is the lack of the EU border control posts, as mentioned by Lord Carrington. When this legislation is passed, this potential profitable and alternative market will be closed to English, Scottish and Welsh farmers due to the welcome higher animal welfare standards. I therefore ask the Noble Minister to encourage the Government to begin, as asked for by the NFU, a formal process of developing and establishing a core production standard that applies to all agricultural imports, as mentioned by the Reverend Bishop. And these standards to apply to all future international trade deals, as to prevent the undercutting of British farmers whose costs are increased by high animal welfare standards, which we all welcome. All these high standards need to be applied not only to production but also to biosecurity. And these issues were highlighted by my noble friend Lord Trees in his recent debate on biosecurity. It is important that if we cannot export our livestock for slaughter, that we do export and promote the UK's high animal welfare standards and maintain a level trading playing field for all UK livestock producers.
My Lords, the Noble Lord the Minister has set out clearly the purposes and remit of this bill, and we have had very interesting contributions from across the House. I support the bill and the contributions which have been made. These measures were in the Conservative manifesto, and the Government are keen to get this bill on the statute. Before they go to the electorate again, they want to be able to say, "We delivered on our manifesto." Sadly, this is not exactly the case. Before I go on to deal with what the bill includes, I will just mention those issues which it does not. Banning puppy smuggling, amending the Zoo Licensing Act of 1981, banning the keeping of primates as pets, protecting sheep from dangerous dogs. When the Government abandoned the Kept Animals Bill, it was relying on a number of private members' bills and smaller government bills to fill the gaps. Some private members' bills were successful. The banning of glue traps was one such, and that was thanks to the intrepid Baroness Fuchs. Others, such as the banning of the import of hunting trophies, were not. However, we are today debating the Animal Welfare Livestock Export Bill. We have heard from many who, quite rightly, are passionate about animal welfare. The noble Baronesses Fuchs and Hodgson of Abinger and Lord Trees are such. I am grateful for the briefings I have received from the NFU, the RSPCA, the Wildlife and Countryside Link, Compassion in World Farming and the House of Lords Library. The bill prohibits, as has been said, the export of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs and equines for slaughter or fattening for subsequent slaughter. No animals have been transported for these purposes since December 2020. This is due entirely to Brexit and there no longer being any suitable border control posts in French or Belgian ports to receive the live exports. There is, however, in future, nothing to stop suitable border control post being set up specifically for this purpose. It is therefore essential that the UK law is changed now to prevent the export of live animals for slaughter or fattening before slaughter. The ban does not apply to live animal movements for breeding and competition purposes, provided adequate safeguards are in place to protect the animal's health and well-being during transportation. And this provides much-needed reassurance to the owner of equines and other breeding stock. Day-old chicks are exempt from the provisions of this bill, as we've already heard. In September 21, the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee in the other place published a report which welcomed the proposed legislative ban included in this bill. My Lords, that was over 2 years ago, but nothing like as long as Lady Fuchs has been waiting. This issue is taking far too long to get onto the statute. Let us hope we can speed the process up. My Lords, there is an issue around the number and distribution of abattoirs, and Lord Trees and others have referred to this. In the past, there were abattoirs within easy reach of farmers. However, that is no longer the case, and farmers are taking their animals further and further to slaughter. This is not good for the animals, nor for the farmers who are spending so much time away from their farms. I recently met a colleague who I'm not seen for some considerable time and asked her how she was doing. She said she had given up her farming as she was having to transport her stock over 200 miles for slaughter. She felt this was not good for her animals and the cost made it uneconomic to continue. And Lord Carrington has referred to the journey times to abattoirs. I understand that the government are making £4 million available in the form of grants to support smaller abattoirs to improve. What is also needed is more accessible abattoirs so that farmers do not have to travel so far. Is the government planning to increase the number of abattoirs, particularly in rural areas? And Baroness Hodgson has also raised this issue. The majority of the comments I have received have been overwhelmingly in favour of the bill. However, the NFU have expressed concern that no impact assessments were provided with the proposals. The impact assessment that was provided had been produced for the Kept Animals Bill, subsequently abandoned. That IA indicated that a loss of around £5.2 million over a 10-year period would be suffered mainly by sheep exporters, and Lord Carrington has referred to sheep farmers. My Lords, this is a significant sum for a section of the farming community that is generally not affluent. The NFU are concerned that British farmers will be undercut by imports which don't meet the same high animal welfare standards which exist here. The NFU are calling for the establishment of core production standards that apply to agri-food imports. This would assist in providing a level playing field for British farmers, and I fully support the NFU with this and agree with the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Edmondsbury and Ipswich. The British Veterinary Association and the Farmers Union of Wales also support the call for British livestock farmers not to be undercut by trade deals which don't meet equivalent animal welfare standards. And can the Minister give reassurance on this issue? My Lords, the bill does not ban the import of live animals for slaughter, and Baroness McIntosh has referred to this. In July last year, the Noble Lord Benyon stated that from 2019 to 21, only 91 cattle and 14 sheep were imported for slaughter from mainland EU. Can the Noble Lord the Minister give an update on this figure and say how many animals are currently imported for slaughter, if any? The bill does not apply to Northern Ireland, and we have heard from those directly affected by this bill this afternoon, Lord Dubbs, Baroness Hoey and Baroness Ritchie. However, the movement of live animals covered by the bill is still allowed throughout the island of Ireland, as Northern Ireland is treated as part of the EU, as we have heard very eloquently already. The movement of animals within the UK Channel Islands and the Isle of Man is still allowed. However, all live ruminants from Great Britain are currently banned from entering Northern Ireland due to a case of blue tongue virus in Kent. Can I ask the Minister whether this ban is likely to be lifted anytime soon? Compassion in World Farming say that in 2019-2020, animals were transported to designations in Bulgaria and Hungary via Northern Ireland. Even when exports are destined for the Republic of Ireland, there was no way of knowing what the final destination would be, as AIR has a large live export trade to the EU and the Middle East. However, once this bill becomes law, this trade will end and the risk to animal welfare will cease from GB. The Northern Ireland livestock market is affected by live animal exports restrictions, as in 2020 this trade was worth £938 million. That is 31% of Northern Ireland total exports to Ireland. The NFU believes that the live trade is essential to stimulate competition for livestock and ensure that farmers have access to the best paying markets, and Baroness Ritchie has referred to this. The RSPCA believes that the wording of the bill is compatible with WTO rules and meets the conditions of the EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. My Lords, this is a fairly short and complicated bill. It aims to prevent animals being shipped overseas for fattening and slaughter, a process which causes distress as the animals are often kept in restricted conditions and have limited access to food and water. And we have heard many examples this afternoon describing the suffering of the animals as a result. My Lords, all contributors, it seems to me, are in agreement. As a nation of animal lovers, the public are fully on board with the aim of this bill and want to see it passed quickly. The bill is not completely perfect, but I urge all present to support this bill and amend it to hasten its passage. Hear, hear.
My Lords, can I start by declaring my interest as set out in the Register as President of the Rare Breeds Survival Trust, and also thank the Noble Lord the Minister for his introduction to the bill. We welcome this legislation. Labour has previously called for a ban on live exports, and it's something that I've personally campaigned on as well, but not as long as the Noble Lady Baroness Fuchs, who has worked so long and hard on this, and I congratulate her for her efforts and for her birthday present today. But we do regret that it has taken so long to bring it with us, bring it forward today, because it could already be on the statute. We've heard about the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill, which disappeared last May. If that had come forward, it could be on the statute already. So it is a regret that we haven't done this sooner. But we're very pleased to see that we are debating it today. However, as the Noble Lady Baroness Bakewell of Harlington Manuel said, there are certain elements of that bill that are still to appear. So we would hope to see that promised legislation also coming forward. As we've heard, the bill applies to cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, wild boar, horses and certain other related animals, with the proposed ban applying only to slaughter and fattening exports and clearly not prohibiting animals travelling for other purposes, for example, breeding or competition. Yet the export of breeding stocks did represent a huge percentage of all exports pre-Brexit in 2019. I heard that one intention following Brexit was to intensify this by making the UK the centre for breeding stock and genetic exports for the world. And that was according to the director of the UK Export Certification Partnership. So could I ask the Noble Lord whether or not it is still the case to support that? Considering that the intention to ban livestock export is on welfare grounds, and that breeding stocks are exported and then transported using the same standards as fattening slaughter stocks, it is also critical that these journeys are undertaken to the highest standards, and a number of Noble Lords have talked about this. So, for example, while obviously it's good that animals are not transported when conditions at sea are poor, we do need a clearer regulations and information about what happens to the animals while they're waiting for better sea conditions in order to be transported. You know, how are they kept? Are they still in the trucks? Are they unloaded? How are they fed and watered? What are those conditions? I think it's really important that the Noble Lord and the government are able to provide reassurance on that aspect. And as my noble friend Baroness Young of Old Scone said, animal welfare can be compromised during long-distance live travel. Animals can experience a range of problems: physical injury, hot or cold stress, hunger, dehydration and exhaustion. And during export, overcrowding means that some cannot lie down at all, while those who do may be injured or trampled. And different animals suffer in different ways. For example, pigs can become very travel sick, even on very short journeys. Newly weaned piglets are also more vulnerable than older animals, particularly to temperature changes. So I was very pleased that Noble Lords, particularly the Noble Lord Trees, talked about the closure of abattoirs and the distance of, that has increased travel within our own shores for animals. The Noble Lady Baroness Bakewell talked about the government funding for abattoirs, but the problem with that is it's only for to support existing abattoirs. It won't actually stop the issue where abattoirs are already closed and you have huge gaps where you have no abattoirs for many, many, many miles. So I would hope that the Noble Lord, the Minister, would take that away, because ultimately we do need to look at how we replace the abattoirs that have gone. I would also like to thank a number of organisations for their briefings. The RSP, for example, talked about the animals being transported to Spain on journeys that lasted up to 96 hours, and then some animals being slaughtered in Middle Eastern countries such as Lebanon or Libya after being re-exported. And of course, non-stun slaughter is the norm there. Because ultimately, once animals have left our shores, we have no control over how they are reared or how they are slaughtered. The Noble Lady Baroness Fuchs gave some fairly graphic examples of some of the terrible conditions that animals have suffered. But we've also heard that live exports of calved halted after 2019 and sheep after 2020. And the final export of live farm animals overseas occurred with 5 lorries laden with sheep that left over on the 31st of December 2020. And since then, no live sheep have been exported across the Channel because, again, as we've heard, there have been no border control posts set up by France and Belgium to receive them. And post-Brexit animals must go through a BCP. So the question is that other lords have talked about is then why do we need this bill? And it's because, of course, without a legal ban, the exports could start up again, leaving thousands of British animals vulnerable to cruel and stressful and often unnecessary journeys. So to be clear, if a suitable BCP were to be installed at Calais and the UK government had not secured this live exports ban in law, the train could resume via the same vessels and routes that were being used before January 2021. And in addition, while commercial ferry companies currently don't accept the transport of live animals for slaughter or fattening overseas or sailings across the English Channel, there's nothing in law to prevent them from changing that position. And another scenario, of course, is that an individual or a company could charter a vessel to operate between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and this would then allow the trade to resume via Ireland, where there is then a large onward trade to the rest of the EU and beyond. So this bill is designed to prevent this from occurring, and we support that. And certain noble lords, the Noble Lord Dodds, the Noble Lady Baroness Huey, and my noble friend Baroness Ritchie of Dan Patrick, have talked about the impact on Northern Ireland and how the bill relates to Northern Ireland and the Republic. And I'd be quite interested to hear the Noble Lord, the Minister's response to that, because these are very legitimate questions and concerns if we are to ensure that this legislation is going to operate in the way that we would hope it would. The noble lady, Baroness Hodgson, also made some important point of keeping a close eye on imports, as did other noble baronesses. On farming concerns, the noble Lord Carrington talked about this. The NFU has raised concerns about trade negotiations with countries that export large number of animals for fattening and slaughter. British livestock farmers, it's really important, noble lords have talked about this, the importance of not allowing our own farmers to be undercut by imports that don't meet the same high standards that we adhere to in this country. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Edmundsbury in Ipswich, talked at length about this. And I'm sure I don't need to remind the noble lord that we signed trade deals not very long ago with at least one country that doesn't have standards compatible with this proposed legislation. For example, Australia still permits the live export of animals over long distances, including overseas. Lower animal welfare standards should not be imported, and we should be using our influence to drive standards up in the countries with whom we do trade deals. Poultry has been mentioned by a number of noble lords, but it's poultry and rabbits, of course, that are excluded from the bill. Yet we know that they are highly sensitive to the effects of heat stress. Rabbits and poultry are the most frequently exported animals pre-Brexit, particularly the trade in day-old chicks, which again we've heard about during this debate, and neither are more resilient to transportation than any other animal. The noble lady Baroness Mackintosh of Pickering asked about the exclusion of poultry from the bill. But what I think is really important is if poultry and rabbits are not included, we do need very strong assurances that any cross-border trade from Britain in day-old chicks and rabbits is going to meet strict transport and animal welfare standards. The noble Lord de Clifford particularly talked about standards during transport, and I think it's really important that we have those strong reassurances and that proper checks are done so that we can feel that any people who are breaking those standards are actually held to account. I'd like to finally briefly mention horses. The World Horse Welfare recently drew the attention of the EFRA Select Committee to the huge numbers that are still being illegally exported to Europe under the guises of sport, competition or breeding, where they end up being slaughtered. I just wondered if the noble lord was aware of this practice, because if obviously transport for breeding and competition is going to be allowed, it's really important that it doesn't open the door to such illegal practices. So is the government intending to tackle this as part of implementing this bill into law? Because it's really important that this is stopped. At this point, I'd also like to support my noble friend Barbara Young regarding the opportunity to add further animals into the bill as an amendment to cover any future issues. It's important that this bill is as solid as it possibly can be, and there are always changes in the future that we need to kind of manage as we go through legislation. So in conclusion, banning live export for fattening and slaughter has been both a Labour and Conservative manifesto commitment, and other parties as well. So we strongly support the bill. We want to see it reach royal assent as soon as possible. So I'm hoping that in a general election year that the government will treat this as a priority, because we cannot afford to risk it being lost. Yeah.
My Lords, I would like to thank all 14 of noble lords and baronesses who have spoken for their thoughtful and constructive comments today, in particular started by Baroness Young, those who have congratulated me on my appointment and this being my first bill, and in particular to have delivered such a happy birthday present to Baroness Fuchs. Always a pleasure. As we've heard, the bill will end the unnecessary export of livestock and horses for slaughter and fattening and prevent the associated stress and exhaustion and injury caused by these journeys. It signals to our international partners our firm commitment to improving animal welfare standards for all kept animals, reinforcing our position as global leaders on this important issue. Many animal welfare groups have called for this ban on live exports, as well as a number of parliamentarians. We know that there is also a huge public support for this measure. There is a clear and broad recognition that we must end these unnecessary journeys. Before I address a number of specific questions, let me just touch on two quick things. One from Baroness Bakewell on the blue tongue virus, which is very current at the moment. I don't actually have a current time frame when this is going to be lifted, but I will get back to her as soon as I do have that. And the other one I just quickly wanted to mention, Baroness Hayman, on your issue of the welfare of animals during a delay to transport. I will write and confirm the exact details of how they're looked after and how we address this issue. Let me turn now to the questions that have been asked by noble lords and baronesses. The noble baroness, Baroness Young, Baroness Fuchs, Baroness Jones, and many others queried why other species were not within the scope of this ban. I can reassure them that the bill's definition of relevant livestock covers all species for which there has been a significant slaughter export trade and which the government consulted on in 2020. In the 10 years prior to the EU exit, the live export trade for slaughter and fattening mainly involves sheep and unweaned calves. Compassion in the World Farming and RSPCA, both leading campaigners on banning live exports for the past 50 years, agree that the bill covers the relevant species to end this unnecessary trade. Responding to proposed amendments in the other place, Compassion said they are not aware of any alpacas, llamas or deer being exported for slaughter, and RSPCA said only sheep, calves and horses have been exported from Britain for slaughter over the last 10 years. The issue of small abattoirs was raised by the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Edmondsbury and Ipswich, Lord Carrington, Lord Trees, Baroness Hoey, Baroness Hodgson, Lord de Clifford, Baroness Bakewell and Baroness Hayman, so it was a popular subject today. Many asked what further financial assistance there is for small abattoirs and what work we are doing to promote and market sheep products, particularly to develop our meat trade export. The Farming Investment Fund has offered access to financial support to establish new producer-led abattoirs. Now that the first round is closed, we will be assessing how the scheme has performed and will be investigating the potential of launching a second round of the scheme later this year. The government is working with the Agriculture and Horticultural Development Board and industry to help secure market access for world-class British red meat and dairy, empowering our exporters to maximise opportunities on the global stage. The Noble Lord Trees queried whether Northern Ireland could be used as a loophole for transporters wanting to export livestock for slaughter and fattening, and I'd like to assure the Noble Lord that the requirements when moving animals to Northern Ireland would make such a slaughter trade uneconomic. Livestock transported for slaughter from Great Britain to Northern Ireland must go directly to the slaughterhouse. It would be an offence to take them anywhere else. When livestock are being moved for other purposes, they must be moved directly to the holding of destination and remain there for at least 30 days. Failure to do so is an offence and may result in prosecution. We will also continue to monitor volumes as they, over the next few years, as this policy takes effect.
Sorry, Minister, thank you. Just quite rightly, you have said about the 30 days and that stops, in theory anyway, from Great Britain to Northern Ireland to going on. But what about all the animals in Northern Ireland that won't be affected by that 30 days, that will go over into the Republic, down to Rosslare, onto a long journey to France and then on to Morocco?
Well, it's a very good point that the Noble Baroness makes. Once animals are passed into the Republic of Ireland, of course, it's out with the jurisdiction of this bill. So that is the current position. And I'd also like to address the Noble Lord Dodds and Baroness Hose very eloquently described issues around Northern Ireland and the bill, and I hope that they will appreciate that I'm somewhat constrained on this issue, and perhaps I might write to them separately on the concerns that they've raised. Lord Dodds raised the question of negotiations with the EU on veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland, and the government is committed to seeing a long-term sustainable solution ahead of December 2025 that will properly support the flow of veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland from Great Britain on an enduring basis. It remains our priority to find a solution that removes the barriers to supply of veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland through technical talks with the EU. The government is very clear that in all scenarios it is imperative to safeguard the supply of veterinary medicines into Northern Ireland, and if necessary we will deploy all available flexibilities in line with our legal obligations. Noble Lords, Lord Carrington and Baroness Hayman asked about the impact of this legislation on farmers and businesses, and the current position is that we expect the ban to have minimal impact. We published an impact assessment in 2021, which can be accessed via the bill's explanatory notes. We estimated the direct cost to businesses of ending live exports to be around 5.2 million across the 10-year appraisal period, so about $500,000 a year. As there have been no exports for this purpose since 2020, the impact will have further decreased. My noble friend, Baroness McIntosh, Baroness Young and Lord Carrington also asked about border control posts on the northern coast of France. EU border control posts can only be operated with the approval of the competent authority in the relevant EU member state. The majority of BCPs are privately operated, and the main barrier to date for the establishment of a BCP for livestock is the commercial viability of such a site. We've encouraged our counterparts in France to do more to support commercial efforts to construct and operate a BCP for livestock, and we continue to engage with them to try and resolve this issue.
Some on that point, because most ports are owned by the state across the European Union. So is there any wriggle room that my noble friend could interject, the government could interject with the government of France to ask them to look into some sort of help? It does look like a rather protectionist measure as it stands.
I do understand the point the noble Baroness is making, and I can assure her that our officials are working very hard on this particular issue, but it's not going at pace at the moment. The noble Baroness McIntosh also asked why this bill had been brought forward when there are other issues facing our farming sector, and it's important that we put an end to this unnecessary trade permanently. Although there have been no exports of livestock for slaughter recently, given that there is demand from the EU for sheep from Great Britain, we would expect that trade to restart in the future if we did not legislate to ban live exports now. The noble Baroness McIntosh also asked whether there were any plans to introduce corresponding ban on animals imported for slaughter and fattening. And there's never been a particularly significant import trade for slaughter or fattening. For example, in 2019, there were only 91 cattle and 178 sheep imported for slaughter or fattening from mainland Europe. The Noble Baroness, Baroness Bakewell and Baroness Hayman reflected on the government's broader animal welfare commitments, and I would like to take the opportunity to reassure them that we remain committed to our other animal welfare manifesto commitments, which we are to crack down on legal puppy smuggling and the ban on keeping primates as pets and prevent livestock worrying. On the question of poultry raised by the Noble Baroness Hayman, when we consulted on banning live exports for slaughter or fattening, we were clear that we were not proposing to extend the ban to poultry. There have been no exports of adult poultry for slaughter in recent years. However, I am appreciative of the poultry industry and breeding companies do export around 25 million day-old chicks every year, but no welfare concerns have been identified with this practice. My Lords, once again I would like to thank all of those who have spoken today for their thoughtful and valuable comments. It has been hugely encouraging to hear the broad consensus throughout this debate on the importance of protecting and enhancing the welfare of the animals in our care. I think it is also clear that we can agree on the core aims of this bill. I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. As many as of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content, the contents have it.
I beg to move the motion in my name as on the order paper.
The question is that this bill be committed to a grand committee. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content, the contents have it. We'll take a few moments for noble lords who wish to do so to leave the chamber before we take the next business. Now, my lords, we'll move to the next business, which is questions on an answer to an urgent question asked in the House of Commons on Monday the 19th of February on the UK economy entering recession.
My lords, the UK's growth forecast was recently downgraded every single year for the next 3 years. Debt is set to surpass £3 trillion for the first time ever. We are seeing the biggest ever fall in living standards, and the tax burden is set to reach its highest ever level. Now the ONS have confirmed that Britain has fallen into recession, with GDP per capita falling in every single quarter of the past year. Yet the Chancellor says our plan is working. May I ask the Noble Baroness, was it part of the government's plan, having spent 14 years in the economic slow lane, to now put our economy into reverse?
I absolutely do believe that our plan is working, and it's critical that we continue along the path that we have set out. Because one of the biggest challenges that we face in this country, and we have done over recent months, has been high inflation. That is the biggest barrier to growth, and that is why halving it is still our top priority. And thanks to decisive action supported by the government, inflation has fallen. Now, if one looks at what happens when inflation falls, it means that interest rates can also then fall. And of course, that will also mean that growth will begin to rise. The Noble Lord mentioned growth. It is the case that the government has policies for growth. They are very clear, and Noble Lords will be discussing them with me shortly as we debate the Finance Bill.
Resolution Foundation has reported that GDP per capita is now 4.2% below its pre-cost of living crisis path, and that's the equivalent of a loss of nearly £1,500 per household. The OBR has said that we are set to see the biggest fall in living standards since 1950. Does the government understand that for ordinary people, Their plan is delivering real day-to-day pain and often deprivation, and nothing she has said or proposes to do changes that, as she will see if she looks at the forecast.
Well, I think what is absolutely clear is the forecasts do show that the UK is forecast to grow and indeed grow very strongly. We are forecast to grow faster than Japan, than Germany, than France and than Italy over the next 5 years by the IMF. Now, I absolutely accept that the economy has seen some very significant challenges over recent years, the global instability in Ukraine and the Middle East and the legacy of COVID. And I was a minister throughout that period, and at no time did I ever hear any ideas from either the party opposite or the Liberal Democrats that would have put the economy in a better situation than we are now. It was always calls for more spending, for longer periods of time. My Lords, we have to fix the issues that that appeared mostly due to external factors, which is exactly what we're doing. The economy is turning a corner. Indeed, it has turned a corner thanks to our decisive action.
The noble lady accept that when she refers to global headwinds, that an economy like the United States has experienced exactly the same headwinds. And instead of opening our newspapers and reading every day that the Chancellor intends to give enormous universal tax cuts on the 6th of March, wouldn't it be more sensible for the government to acknowledge that the people who are hurting the most from the cost of living crisis are the people at the bottom lower income deciles, and those are the people that should be targeted for assistance if there is any money going?
Obviously, I can't comment on any potential tax cuts in the future, and I'm sure my noble, the noble lady will agree that actually the US has a very different economic structure than the UK, and potentially tends to offer slightly less support to those at the bottom end of the ladder. And now the noble lady did mention those who are the most vulnerable, and I would say that personal allowances have gone up 30% in real terms than in 2010. That means 30% of people now pay no tax. We are focusing our interventions on people at the lower end of the income scale, but we are also focusing our interventions on growing business.
Not agree with me that comparisons with the United States are not really appropriate, particularly given cheap energy costs due to fracking in the States, which we don't have. What might be better is to compare us with European countries, and since 2010 the UK has had the fastest growth of any European G7 country, so that's faster than Italy, Spain, Germany, France. And does she agree with me to welcome the news today that the budget surplus for net borrowing excluding banks shows a surplus for January of 16.76 billion, and today the announcement that the UK Purchasing Managers Index has risen in January to 52.9. So rather than knocking the economy, let's celebrate the good news.
I agree with my noble friend. Let us celebrate good news, and I do believe that there will be more good news to come. And my noble friend mentioned debt, and I think it is fair to reassure noble lords that we are on track for debt to fall as a share of the economy. Public sector net debt as a percentage of GDP is expected to fall next year to the end of the forecast. If one were to exclude Bank of England debt, it will fall in the final year, and public sector net borrowing as a percentage of GDP is forecast to fall every single year. We also have the second lowest debt as a share of GDP in the G7.
My Lords, the Minister has talked about curbing inflation. It's a very strange policy that the government has. Let me characterise it as somebody who's got an ailment. They go to see their doctor who dusts a 100-year-old book, and regardless of the reasons for the ailment, the answer is the same remedy. So whether inflation is called by wage rises, inequalities, profiteering, it's the same policy. We must increase the interest rates and force ordinary people to hand over their wealth to the banks. That is no policy because it causes other ailments. Would the Minister tell us what other ailments have been caused by this remedy adopted by the government?
As the Noble Lord will know, interest rates are just one of the levers that the Bank of England has to influence inflation. The government can also play a key role in tackling inflation, for example, by ensuring that public sector pay awards are kept within reasonable bounds.
Can I have another bite here? I mean, you said public sector wages are within reasonable bounds, which suggests that the government thinks wage rises are inflationary, but that does not apply to executive pay, that does not apply to profiteering, does not apply to dividends, does not apply to share buybacks. Are they not inflationary as well? If they are, why are you not curbing them?
The Noble Lord well knows that inflation is caused by a vast amount of different factors. But what was the case is that when we announced our interventions at the autumn statement, the OBR did say that they were not inflationary, and that is another way that the government had to put downward pressure on inflation. And as we have seen, the proof is in the pudding. We have gone from 11% in October 2022 to 4% in January 24.
Add that the noble lady, the Minister, feels encouraged by the latest figures, but can she understand why some people who have inflated mortgages feel they have them because of the antics of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, admittedly not the responsibility of the noble lady?
As the Noble Lord will be aware, the reason why interest rates are particularly high is to control inflation. The Bank of England now expects inflation to get back to the target of around 2% in the early summer. If that can happen, of course, interest rates will then be able to come down.
Would the noble friend agree with me that
sorry, thank you. Would my noble friend consider a longer-term anti-inflationary policy, such as ensuring that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England and the Governor build into their forecasting model a measure to take account of the growth in money supply each year?
I will take that idea back to the Bank of England.
agree with me that it's highly complimentary to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to suggest that their actions are responsible for interest rates in every country around the world which are broadly comparable to ours.
Well, as I said, I think earlier on in answering this question, all sorts of countries have faced the challenges that the UK has, and actually there have been a number of countries over the second half of 2023, either in Q3 or Q4, that saw a small technical contraction in their economy. But I would say that Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England Governor, does believe that the technical recession may already be over, and I would expect us to return to growth very soon.
My Lords, the time allowed for that question is now elapsed, so we come to next business. Second reading of the Finance Bill, Baroness Peer of Norbiton.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time. Sorry. My Lords, it's a pleasure to open this debate on the Finance Bill. As I explained during a memorable debate in your Lordship's House last year, the autumn statement was designed with three purposes in mind: to drive growth across the economy, to create jobs, and to ensure that hard-working people can keep more of what they earn. As many noble lords will know, since the beginning of 2023, we have been working on 5 priorities. 3 of those priorities are economic ones: to halve inflation, grow the economy, and reduce the national debt. I will outline our current economic picture in more detail shortly. And a year on from when we set out these priorities, I am pleased to report that there has been some significant progress. On inflation, this has fallen from 11.1% to 4%, and this has led to 2 positive outcomes. Wages are rising faster than inflation, and mortgage rates are starting to come down. On growth, like some other similar economies, the UK faced challenges at the end of 2023, but overall the economy was larger at the end of the year than it was at the start. and the Bank of England and the IMF forecast growth to increase over the next few years. And finally, our national debt is on track to fall as a share of the economy. My Lords, the government proposed at the autumn statement to put money back in people's pockets, cut taxes and back British business. That's why the National Insurance Contributions Act has reduced national insurance from 12% to 10%, delivered a tax cut for 29 million working people, and saved the average worker £450 a year. But I recognise that times are still far too tough for far too many. And that is why we need to stick to our plan, so that we can deliver the long-term change our country needs to deliver a brighter future for Britain and improve economic security and opportunity for everyone. As part of delivering our broader long-term plan, we need to deliver our autumn statement commitments, and this finance bill does exactly that. First, it will support British businesses by allowing them to invest for less. Second, it will support employment by ensuring that hard work pays through reforms to our pension system. And finally, its measures will improve and simplify our tax system, ensuring that it is fit for purpose. Indeed, the Finance Bill covers 36 different measures in total, some more technical than others. But before I delve into the specifics of these measures, let me first outline some of the economic context behind this Finance Bill. As noble lords will be aware, inflation and the subsequent impact on the cost of living has been the government's key challenge since Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it is significant that, as I noted previously, inflation has more than halved from 11.1% in late 2022 to 4% in February. Our key priority remains getting inflation back to the 2% target in order to drive sustainable growth. The recent GDP figures are a reminder that, while inflation has more than halved from 11% to 4%, wages are rising, mortgage rates are falling, and taxes are being cut. But we are not out of the woods yet. There is more to do. The OBR has projected that the 2023 autumn statement policies will have lasting supply-side effects. Combined with policies from the spring budget in 2023, this approach will permanently boost output by 0.5% by 2028-29. I will now outline the measures in the Finance Bill which will back British business, reward work, and support a modern and simpler tax system. So, to the suite of measures to back British business. First, we will make full expensing permanent, thus allowing businesses to invest for less. As a result, firms will save £10 billion a year, the most generous plant and machinery capital allowances of any major economy. This will drive 0.1% GDP growth over the next 5 years, and that number will increase to 0.2% every year over the longer term. It is forecast to unlock an additional £3 billion of investment per year. My Lords, the government's second measure recognises the importance of research and development, or R&D. R&D is important because of its dual role, driving economic growth and bringing benefits to wider society through innovation. Therefore, we will merge two government programmes, the R&D Expenditure Credit, or RDEC scheme, and the Small to Medium-Sized Enterprises, SMEs, scheme. This will have two key impacts. It will simplify the system, and it will provide greater support for UK firms to drive innovation. These changes will apply from 2024 onwards, and I should note that the government has consulted widely on proposed changes to the R&D tax credit system over a considerable period of time. We have decided to proceed with an April 2024 implementation date to move the system onto a more stable footing at the earliest possible opportunity. And in this bill, we have gone even further by introducing greater support for loss-making R&D intensive SMEs. In addition, we will also lower the R&D intensity threshold required to access this support to 30%. As a result, around 5,000 extra SMEs will now be covered by the support and will receive £27 per £100 of qualifying R&D invested. I note that the Noble Lords on the Economic Affairs Finance Bill subcommittee want us to simplify this scheme further by bringing it within the merged scheme at a higher rate of relief. It is worth being aware that the intensive scheme will share many of the merged scheme's rules, including on subcontracting, albeit with a different rate mechanism given the merged scheme is above the line. While there is potentially an option to simplify in the future, further work is needed to establish how that would operate while still targeting the scheme effectively. These measures significantly increase support to firms' R&D efforts by about £280 million per year by 2028-29. And we will also extend the sunset clause for 2 more programmes, the Enterprise Investment Scheme and the Venture Capital Trust Scheme. Both of these will be extended to the 6th of April 2035, providing support to young companies in their endeavours to raise capital. My Lords, the UK's creative industries grew 1.5 times faster than the wider economy between 2010 and 2019. It's therefore right that the government offers it our fullest support. So that's why we will reform tax reliefs to refundable expenditure credits for the film, TV and video games industries. In addition to this, we have designed targeted measures to boost investment in 3 areas: animated film, animated TV and children's TV programmes. These areas will now be eligible for a 5% uplift in tax relief to a 39% credit rate. My Lords, this government believes hard work must be appropriately rewarded, and that is why we are using this bill to legislate for the abolition of the lifetime allowance. The OBR estimates that this will retain 15,000 workers annually in the UK labour market. And the British Medical Association described it as potentially transformative for the NHS because many of the individuals will be highly skilled, including senior doctors. And it will affect this transformation with the right incentives. By removing pension tax limits, individuals will be motivated to work harder for longer so that they can reap the rewards in future years. Finally, to measures in support of the 3rd objective of our finance bill, a simpler and modernised tax system. This bill, as I've previously mentioned, makes full expensing permanent, which is a huge simplification for larger firms. But we're also supporting over 4 million smaller growing traders by expanding the cash basis. This will simplify the process for them to calculate their profits and pay income tax. We've closely consulted with industry, and as a result of this, the government will legislate to remove 3 of the main restrictions on using the cash basis, completely removing limits on the size of business able to use the basis, interest deductions and loss relief available. My Lords, we must also make sure that HMRC delivers on its strategic objective to collect the right tax at the right time. This bill will deliver this by enabling HMRC to reduce the off-payroll working PAYE liability of a deemed employer who is responsible for ensuring PAYE is calculated and sent to HMRC correctly. This will apply where that engagement was incorrectly treated as self-employed for tax purposes. Of course, we need to ensure that UK PLC is following, adopting and influencing developments on taxation on the global stage. And that's why in the spring we legislated to implement OECD Pillar 2 in the UK, and this built on a historic international agreement to a 2-pillar solution to the tax challenges of a globalised digital economy. This bill goes on to make technical amendments to the main Pillar 2 rules as identified from stakeholder consultation, and ensures the UK remains consistent with the latest internationally agreed guidance. We will also take forward other technical measures, such as improving the data HMRC collects from its customers. These will result in a trusted, modern tax administration system. But, my Lords, a simple, modernised tax system must also be fundamentally fair. Therefore, this bill will create a criminal offence for promoters of tax avoidance, specifically where persons continue to promote a scheme after the receipt of a stop notice. The bill will also ensure HMRC is empowered to respond more quickly to tackle promoters of tax avoidance. It will do so by introducing a new power for HMRC to bring disqualification action
against the directors of companies involved in promoting tax avoidance. The scope of that power will include being applicable against those who control or exercise influence over a company. Further to that objective of fairness, our next measure under this objective will amend the construction industry scheme to reduce the scope for tax fraud in that industry. To do so, the amendment will add VAT to the gross payment status test. This means two things. VAT compliance will now be checked as part of this process, and HMRC powers to remove gross payment status will be enhanced. We will also legislate to confirm that, in line with the retained EU Law Act, where UK law is incompatible with EU law, UK VAT and excise law will prevail. This measure also ensures stability of the VAT and excise regimes whilst providing legal certainty for business following the changes in the retained EU Law Act taking effect. My Lords, this protects billions of pounds for the Exchequer. My Lords, this finance bill delivers some of the Chancellor's key announcements at Autumn Statement 2023. As I have just set out, it backs British business, rewards hard work and supports a modern and simpler tax system. My Lords, I beg to move.
Is that this bill be now read a second time?
My Lords, the finance bill gives us a chance to raise issues which others may regard as hobby horses, but I think are important topical matters, technical matters, which can value from being drawn to the noble Baroness, the Minister's attention. I've got two issues on my agenda. First, there's the implications for the recipients of the state pension of the government's policy of freezing income tax personal allowances, and secondly, the taxation of pension benefits following on from the abolition of the lifetime allowance. Now, of course, those with a very long memory will be aware that there was something called the Rooker-Wise Amendment, Rooker being my noble friend Lord Rooker, back in 1977, when it was laid down for the first time in legislation that the personal allowance should be increased each year in line with inflation. And I think technically that's still in force. However, successive governments, this government, has opted out through finance bills of that requirement to index link. Now, my understanding, and I asked the Minister for confirmation of this, that the freeze, which is now proposed to go up to 27-28, was provided for in last year's Finance Act, the bill that came before us a year ago, and so there's no need for it to appear again in this bill, except that, does this imply that the government has given up on rolling forward the period over which the personal allowance will be frozen? It is actually shorter this year than last year. Is that a clear statement of policy, or has it just been left out and we can't forecast a budget, will we be told? But perhaps if it's not in the budget, if it's not in PERDA, does the freezing only last until the year that we were told it was going to be, or is it going to be rolled forward another year? Now, this is very pertinent to the main point I want to raise, which is the impact that this freezing of the personal allowance has on pensioners, particularly those pensioners who are mainly dependent on the state pension. Because the state pension, as we know, and all parties currently committed to, is being increased in line with the triple lock. So it actually goes up faster than inflation, earnings 2.5%, whereas the personal allowance is frozen. And the basic, or the new state pension, is currently catching up with the personal allowance rapidly. And my figures, based on the estimates of the Office for Budget Responsibility, is that it will catch up with the personal allowance. This is the new state pension by 27, 28, and the following year, 28, 29, it will exceed the personal allowance. The practical problem is that pensions aren't part of the PAYE system. So where people receive a state pension, and many pensioners receive a state pension which is greater than the state pension because they've got retained rights from the previous scheme, they will owe tax, but they're not part of the tax system. So instead, they have to, beginning of the following year, they get a brown envelope in the post saying, you owe us some money. And this is going to become more and more frequent as the state pension increases and the personal allowance is frozen. Now, I really want the government to say that they're fully aware of this problem and they're on the case, and the obvious answer is that the state pension should be brought within the remit of the PAYE system so that people pay the tax that's due over the year like people do out of their earnings. But I have not yet actually heard the government say, one, they understand the issue that's coming down the road, and two, that they're going to do something about it. So that's really my first question. Just to emphasise the point that the hardest hit will be those earning something like totally from the state pension. Maybe they don't have any other income, or it's very small. They have an income slightly larger than the new state pension, but we're talking £15,000 a year, not exactly riches. That's more than £2,000 more than the personal allowance. They'll be liable for 20% tax on that £2,000, which is £400. So they're going to get a request. This is someone on £15,000 a year who's going to get a request for £400 to be paid as a lump sum. I think that's untenable. I think it will be a crisis when it arrives, and I just hope the government can get advance of the issue. Now, turning to pensions taxation, Clause 14 and Schedule 9, the abolition of the lifetime allowance charge. Now, the Financial Secretary said in the Commons, when introducing this bill, that this was intended as part of a policy to remove both barriers to work and incentives not to work. And I think those remarks were echoed by the Noble Baroness, the Minister. Indeed, the OBR estimated that the abolition of the lifetime allowance would actually mean there would be 15,000 more people at work, not least among the medical profession. That's actually an estimate based on behavioural change, so I think we have to be a bit sceptical, but it will have had that impact. However, I think the government have been too quick to congratulate itself on solving the problem of pension taxation on highly skilled professionals and the extent to which they will still be leaving their jobs because of the impact of the pension tax system. In my view, the annual allowance has always been the bigger problem, particularly when someone is at work. It's the annual allowance that means they get the another brown envelope, but for a significantly larger sum of money early in the following year, saying, in some cases, you owe a sum in excess of £100,000, not unknown. So this is serious issues. Now, the government may think they address that because they increase the annual allowance from 40,000 to 60,000, but still on 60,000 there will still be highly paid, sorely needed professionals who will get the tax charge the following year. But that's not actually the bigger problem. The more immediate problem now is two further problems. First of all, there's the problem of the taper. Now, this is not the venue to start explaining the technical details of pensions taxation, but the taper withdraws the relief that's available on the annual allowance as incomes increase. It's a classic case. Those who are familiar with how taxation will work will know that when you remove a taper, you get very high marginal rates, and there's a taper on the tax payable after allowing for the annual allowance, and the taper is still there. And really, in some ways, some professionals argue that's actually the thing that is really driving them out of employment. And the second issue that needs to be addressed, the removal of the rules were changed, so that if you had two schemes, you were taxed on the growth in the pension in your pension scheme. And under the previous rules, each pension scheme was taken separately. If you happened to be in an old pension scheme, which many doctors were, and then in a new pension scheme because of all the changes that were made to pensions in 2015, you could have a declining value of your pension in one scheme and an increase in the value of your pension in the other scheme. Overall, you didn't really gain much at all, but you were still taxed on the increase on the one scheme, even though you're actually not getting any extra pension. Now, the government addressed that, and you were allowed to combine your schemes from the same employer. What they haven't done is that if your pension went down last year, you got no credit for that if your pension went up the following year. So over the 2-year period, there might be no change in your pension, but you're still having to pay tax on the increase in your pension, the value of the increase in the pension in the following year. So there's these two issues which I hope I've taken the opportunity to draw to the attention of the noble Baroness: the taper and the taxation of negative pensions growth.
It's a pleasure to follow the noble Lord, but I can't say anything technical like he is saying. I just have two observations. First of all, this bill is coming before us far too late to really matter. I know we cannot amend any money bills and so on, but it would have been better had it come when it originally appeared in to the Commons. My one observation is that there's a lot of effort in the finance bill and generally by the government to emphasize tax cuts. And I think that especially tax cut on business corporations. Now, as an economist, I know, and this is very easy to show, that tax cuts don't actually encourage investment in a country. Whatever the corporations do, they don't actually plow it back into investment, because investment depends not on that sort of consideration, but on expectations about growth. Now, what's happened here for the last 15 years is we have had a number of corporation tax cuts and so on, but the economy has not grown. We have had one of the lowest growth experience for the last 15 years, roughly since 2008. So I think we ought to really have the government think sort of seriously, because I know there are more tax cuts being promised in the forthcoming budget. Indeed, the Chancellor is always trying to reassure people that he will find money somewhere, I don't know where, to do a tax cut. Now, my observation is that basically our borrowing rates, the borrowing rates and government debt are right now high, because again and again there have been promises of tax cuts and they have alarmed the markets, especially the Liz Truss tax cut, when it was announced, really spooked the markets very much and really put a lot of pension funds in trouble. So I think my one advice is please be very careful and don't mix up this idea that somehow tax cuts give growth, because that has a opposite effect on what people think there is. And I think that the recession that we have recently experienced, while it's a mild recession, shows that really all this talk of tax cuts ought to stop, and we ought to basically make quite sure that we reduce our borrowing and actually enhance some of the taxes which are not very efficiently imposed. One major thing, and we have seen the proof of that, both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have released their tax sort of news. And I think it showed one very major defect in our tax system, that we tax capital gains at a much lower rate than we tax income. And I don't think that's a healthy thing. We ought to really, and all economists will tell you, that you ought to treat income from income tax, income from earned income, and income from capital gains in a symmetrical way. And I think if we did that, we would increase our tax revenue and we would reduce our deficit.
Well done. My Lord, it's always a great pleasure to follow Lord Desai, even though I don't agree with much of his analysis. In particular, I cannot understand why he thinks that if one takes a risk and invests capital, the rewards for investing capital should be taxed at the same rate as banking a salary from working at a desk. They're two different sources of income and wealth, and therefore deserve different tax treatment. But I do admire the way that he speaks so eloquently without any notes on every occasion. I can only aspire to that. I refer to my register of interests and remind your lordships that I'm chairman of the House of Lords Economic Affairs Finance Bill Subcommittee, to which my noble friend alluded earlier on. So this subcommittee looked at the finance bill with great interest, and our report was published just a couple of weeks ago on the 1st of February. As I think this is the only time that the report will be mentioned in the House, can I use this opportunity to thank the committee members, the clerk, his assistants and colleagues, and in particular the two SPADs, for their very hard work in turning this around in record-breaking time. As Lord Desai has indicated, there was a crunch because it followed the autumn statement to deliver. The report focused on a few main areas. The main one was research and development, where we followed up on last year's report, and we were pleased to see that the R&D review is now complete. We recommended that His Majesty's Government does not make any further changes to R&D tax relief other than some simplifications we recommend. As my noble friend said, research and development is incredibly important to the UK economy, and it's pleasing to note that gross domestic expenditure on R&D has risen from some 1.5% in 2010, let's take a date at random, to nearly 3% now. The new R&D intensive scheme does need careful monitoring, and the threshold, which is a